2, 1. So welcome to Unit 10, if you can believe it, of our course, PR Campaigns. And we are moving right along. We are right on schedule in terms of where we need to be. I appreciate that, and I applaud you all for sticking along with us for this crazy ride. But I hope now that you're starting to see some pieces come into play. I've had some one-on-one conversations with a few of you outside of class this semester, and we've worked through some questions you had about your projects. And in talking to you, it's become very apparent to me, that not only are you taking your assignment this semester seriously, which is goes without saying, but I think you're having some fun with it. I hope you are. And some of you have really gotten creative and have looked at your client and their needs and their interests in many different ways, and are finding different roads to get there. And that really is something I'm excited about, and I know your clients are excited about as well. So I'm very curious to see where your campaigns end up at the end of this semester, but also here to help your campaigns come together piece by piece this semester. We really are at this together. You are certainly not at this alone. That being said, I do want you to circle the class right before Thanksgiving on your calendar. That is the 25th. That is our desired day to host our Cougars Helping Cougars Day, where we'll be able to welcome back alumni to meet and network with each of you and go over your campaign ideas. Again, the way we're going to handle that class, the first 4 teams will spend time meeting with each of our professionals for the first half of class, and the second half of class will meet individually with me. Whatever teams are not meeting with our professionals on the first half of class, we'll meet with them on the back half of class, and then I will meet with them initially to look at their campaigns and talk about some possible ideas. Obviously, when we do this in person in more normal times, it's really exciting to bring our alumni back to campus to get them to meet you directly. This is the closest we have to that right now. So I would implore all of you to take advantage of that opportunity. Certainly can't guarantee you where it may go beyond some great constructive criticism on your projects. But what I can tell you is we've had more interest in this program this year than ever before. And it is likely I'm going to have to unfortunately turn some alumni away just because too many want to help us. And that's a good problem to have. So I'm really going to try to diversify it as much as I can in terms of alumni you get a chance to meet with who want to just, hear your ideas, learn more about your client, see where you're taking your campaign, and be able to kind of, share some of their wisdom and their experience with you as you're in that home stretch. By the time we're in that class, we've probably got maybe less than a third of our semester to go. It just goes by so quickly. And that being said, I do hope you all had a lovely, happy, healthy, safe, and hopefully fun Halloween weekend. I don't know about you, but I think we ended up with a lot more candy than we thought we would. So hopefully you folks found a more creative way to get rid of it than we did here. That being said, today your second draft of your campaign is due. In addition to that, your midterm exam was due. So looking at your midterm exam, I have not looked too closely at the scores yet, but I will be able to do that after class today. Essentially, we're looking at 50 questions, true and false, multiple choice, stretched across everything we discussed since the beginning of class just until a few weeks ago. And it looks to me that I'd say about 75% of you were able to complete that, and that's wonderful. For those of you who have not completed it yet, technically at this point in time, the exam has closed and it is now late. In order to be able to take that exam, we would really need to have a conversation, you and I, to better understand why that exam was missed in order to see if there's a chance to potentially, make it up. Again, we live in very challenging times, and there's certainly reasons why something potentially could be missed. But let's have that conversation as opposed to you just assuming that you can't access that exam. For those of you who took that exam, I would certainly open up the floor, not maybe to any particular questions about questions on the exam. We can talk about that one-on-one during advisement. But if there's any just thoughts or comments or opinion you want to share about the exam overall, the study guide, always want to hear that from you so we can continue to prepare each group better every semester. Any thoughts on the midterm exam, folks, that you care to share? Hey, Farad.
The wording was a little tricky. It wasn't for the most part. I found myself rereading a lot of questions.
Okay.
and I would refer. I feel like had to refer back to my notes more.
Okay.
The study guide didn't really help me much. I feel like it was just more of just lessons within class. Like,
Okay. Okay. I appreciate that. That is helpful feedback. Any feedback and all feedback is welcomed. Anybody else care to share? Donald also echoing in some tricky wording on those questions. Would that be correct, Donald? Okay, your mic isn't working. That's fine.
I know that it was like a couple, like I won't say the specific questions, but where I assumed that it could have been more than one answer.
Mm-hmm.
But that would have been like my only hiccup with the quiz. I thought that it was very concise, and I really liked the fact that it was all multiple choice.
Okay. Okay, so you felt comfortable with the style of the exam, the content tricky.
The process of elimination really helps me more than like,
Okay.
I like open-ended because you can express your thoughts, but I like
Mm-hmm.
multiple choice more because it's like, more precise.
Did you find the study guide helpful at all, at least in terms of
I found the study guide
streamlining?
to help me like find my notes to study on. Like it just gave me like the outline of what
Okay.
to study on. So that
Okay.
was fine.
Okay.
The test really wasn't that difficult
Okay.
personally. So
Okay, and I appreciate that. I mean, this is something you're going to see in terms of format, in terms of style, obviously not content, but format and style. The final exam is going to look identical. You're looking at 50 total questions once more, stretching across from anything we talked about now, going towards the end of the semester. But I won't test you on the same material twice. So and that's something I can definitely tell you. And your final exam will not stretch the whole semester; it'll just stretch the second half of the semester. And again, too, in terms of Naomi's point and Farad and Don, I appreciate you guys chiming in. The PowerPoint slides are always uploaded for you. You could always download them. But obviously the conversations we have with those are very, very summarized, and it really comes down to hopefully your textbook you found helpful and the readings, because again, the questions do certainly directly correlate back there. Does anybody else have questions about the midterm? Okay, so I'll look at it more closely and look at the scores and see where we're at. In terms of an exam of 50 questions at 10 points each, that's a 500-point total. So any grade of a 325 and above is passing. Any grade of a 324 and below would unfortunately be a failure of the exam. So I will take a closer look at that. And if we have to have a conversation, you and I afterwards, if there's any concerns you may have, we can always certainly do that. Just use the You Can Book Me link at any of the bottoms of my emails, and we can certainly schedule something as soon as possible, because the midterm really is a way to check in halfway and see what your command of the material is, maybe see where you want to make some improvements. And particularly in a class like this, the test serves a purpose just to kind of check in. I'm certainly more interested in seeing how you apply the material, but if you are struggling with the material and the test score is a little low, then unfortunately that may tell us that you need a little more, assistance, or maybe stepping back a little bit to make sure you can really apply the material the best you can in your campaign. So let's just take a look at those exams and stay in touch as best we can. That being said, too, for anybody who joined the call late, again, just sent an email out today to you all. If you could please, from your teams, send me the second draft of your campaign, and I will get that and the first draft back to you with some comments ASAP. That being said, you now know we are in registration advisement time. So an email should have gone out earlier today to all of you. Hopefully you received it from our school, reminding you to see your designated academic advisor before you schedule. And if you can't see them, at least speak to them or shoot them a quick email. I know schedules are a little varied during this period of remoteness, but you really want to make sure you speak to your advisors to cross-check you're taking the right classes and make sure you get those holds off your accounts so you can register for your classes. In addition to that, I know that we've had internship emails go out recently, and I really would implore all of you to read them closely and see what opportunities exist for our students and who's coming to our school to find our qualified students. Even though we are remote right now, that does not mean that you cannot acquire an internship for credit or more during these times. And I would really implore you all to think about that. Those emails continue to come out from Professor Edgley. In addition to that, there was another email that went out, I think within the last week as well, regarding scholarships. There is now a new web page on our website portion of kane.edu. It's called Scholarships for Students. That's on the School of Communication, Media, and Journalism's webpage. Check it out. There are so many scholarships that could apply to you all during your studies now, and maybe even when you are looking to apply for future studies that you're likely not aware of, but probably could certainly apply to. So I really would implore all of you to take a look at that, and I will certainly, share those links with you. In terms of our course material, which is where we should probably get to, right? We're already, what time is it now? Already 2:20 in the afternoon. So let's take a closer look. A couple of things I wanted to discuss with you today were actually relatively timely. Today, we're going to talk about goal, objectives, and strategies. We'll talk a little bit about the media and the different facets you and I should be aware of. And something I'd like to really add as some food for thought, and coincidentally, it comes off the heels of a incomplete presidential election right now, is a conversation about public opinion. And that is extremely, extremely important. Not so much for politics, politics aside, you and I are being brought in to shape, manage, rehab the image, the reputation of an organization that's built on a mission, a purpose, a cause, right? So you and I have to really understand how public opinion works if we are expected to not only understand that and explain it, but more importantly, influence it. And that is really what I'm hoping we can dial in on today as well. I know we spoke about it last class, that we would tackle the discussion questions from chapter 8 and chapter 9, and we will most certainly do that if we can, given the time. If not, I do want to make sure, though, that we get in this conversation on public opinion, and I will continue to monitor the level of contribution each of you have week in and week out for our discussion questions. And for those of you who have continued to adhere to them and really share your thoughts with the class and constructive criticism, I applaud you for that. For anyone who has felt they may be lacking in that space or has yet to get a chance to do so, by week 10, I would strongly suggest that you find a way to add to those discussions as best you can when you can. So let's jump into it right away without further ado. I'm going to share my screen with you now. And as you all always keep me honest, if by some chance you can't see my screen, let me know so I can make sure I can use this technology better to serve you all. So I do want to open up this PowerPoint slide here and get things underway. So I hope, fingers crossed, can you guys see this?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Fantastic, fantastic. All right. So you can see here there's a lot to talk about today, a lot to talk about. Let's get after it. So first and foremost, the PR planning process. One of your questions, I think it was chapter 9's discussion question, was based upon the different PR planning processes, which one would you appreciate more and why? And you and I have talked about quite a few different processes this semester: race, rope, and this is one here I'll introduce to you. It's called PI, and it takes research out and it really focuses on everything else that comes after. And essentially, I'm bringing this to your attention because this is everything we have before ourselves the rest of this semester. And when you look at this list, this is our roadmap. For the rest of our class, you are now putting all your research results together and entering this planning phase. You're putting the pieces together for your client. And you're now deciding, what should we do? What should this campaign be? What should it become? What should it not be? That's also a really important question. What are things to include in this campaign? What are things we can perhaps leave on the table for a future campaign? Realize your campaign doesn't have to solve everything and be a catch-all. Instead, it has to be a very strategic, step-by-step, planned out solution, right? Or a planned out way to take advantage of an opportunity. Maybe your campaign puts your client on the first steps towards the roads they need to take. That's okay, right? You've got to decide the scope, right? Or the size, the focus of your campaign. In the real world would then come the next phase, implementation. Not asking you folks to do that, but essentially when you plan your campaigns, realize you've got to create a campaign that people can actually turn around and do. based upon the time, based upon the money, based upon the resources that they have or could acquire. And at any point in time, even though you're not doing the campaign, you've got to find a way to think more closely about how your client could evaluate the campaign at its end, as well as at any point during it. These are things you definitely want to think about. And that last piece, evaluation, traces back to the most important thing we're talking about today, which is your objectives. This model looks like this. So essentially, if you want to know what we're talking about the next couple of weeks, this is it. We're going to focus on planning today. Right. Next week, we're tackling implementation, which would be messages, themes, tactics, and the week thereafter, the evaluation portion. We're going to tackle this bit by bit, but if you want essentially a cheat sheet in terms of how to approach these sections now as a team, this would be the best way to do it. Not going to go through this bit by bit here. This is really for you to focus on more by referring back to this slide after reviewing this presentation following class today. So first and foremost, let's get this out of the way. A goal and objectives are often confused, but they are not the same. The definition of a goal, prime test question. It's the broader, more general outcome one wants to see as a result of persuasive efforts. Whose persuasive efforts? Yours. Who wants to see those results? Your client, right? So thinking about it, you ask that question, where is our client now and where do they want to be, or how is our client perceived now and how do they want to be perceived? Any variation of that question, that's going to tell you what the goal for your campaign is. But then essentially you've got to realize that goals are not quantifiable. We can't count them. We can't measure them because they're so broad. So essentially, if the goal is to become a better student, then I've got to ask myself, well, what are the objectives or what are the steps I'm going to take to get there, right? Maybe I'm studying harder. Maybe I'm cutting back on extracurricular activities. Maybe I'm spending more time on self-care, any and all the above, right? But these are the specific and measurable indicators of whether the goals have been met. And if you look at your template for this class, there are two types of goals your client can have. They have a business goal. Why do they exist? And then they have a public relations objective. What do they set out to do? Who do they set out to be? What type of image or reputation do they set out to have? And those are two different things. They're interrelated. One hand certainly washes the other, though more indirectly than another, perhaps some would argue, right? But they are certainly related. And here, those goals boil down to objectives. And your campaign is built to help your client achieve its public relations or organizational goal, right? How do they want to be seen? How do they want to be perceived? You and I now have to look to the research we've done to come up with objectives that are going to help us get there. Why? Because without objectives, we cannot figure out our tactics and we can't decide on our strategies or our approaches to get there. If objectives are the ring or rung, I should say, on the ladder between where we are and where we want to be, right? The strategy is how we're going to climb that ladder, and the tactics are the things we're going to do to get from one ring on the ladder to the next. One of the best analogies I can give you, really, to focus more deeply on this. Does anybody have any questions on the difference between goal and objectives? Okay.
No, pretty clear.
So for your campaigns, like we said, you should have one PR goal in mind. For your campaigns, you should have anywhere from 2 to 4 objectives and no more than 5. They can be short-term or they can be long-term in nature. Again, objectives are the steps we take to get to the goal. Your campaign's calendar could be 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, a year, 2 years, 3 to 5 years. I don't know what you think is necessary. That's up for your team to decide. And there are rules here. Again, no more than 5 objectives. You should have 2 to 4. I'd probably say 3 to 4, to be honest. 2 is a little brief. But you can see here, this first group of objectives, they're too brief. Sure, I understand what you're trying to do here, but we can't measure them. Why can't we measure them? Because they're not SMART, and we've talked about that before. Specific, measurable, actionable, relatable, time-bound. That's where we get that SMART acronym from, right? If we say to publicize special event X, right? There's not a lot for me to work with here. It's an incomplete idea. I need more. You see these examples of objectives here, and they're much more specific. That's the type of specificity that we need to be able to individually identify each as an objective and to be able to measure or evaluate that objective at a later date, right? So you can see the difference here. To publicize special event X is very different from this bullet point here, right? What sets it apart? That's specificity. Case in point, to publicize special event X through the community's daily newspapers, its TV station, and its 3 radio stations during the month of October. We can very easily go back and see if that happened. And if it did, more importantly, we can take credit for it. One of the reasons why objectives is so very important is because they help set out exactly what you aim to do, right? And in doing that, later on, when you go backwards and look to see what happened, you can say, yeah, well, that was one of the objectives from our plan. And if you look at the growth, it happened while we were conducting our plans. And so therefore, there's a very high likelihood that our plan had that positive effect. And that helps you really explain the power of public relations and, more importantly, what your campaign has done for your client. So you want to think in this way. Every time you create an objective, you have to ask yourself, well, is it SMART, number one? And number two, does that objective relate back to the goal, right? So again, they've got to be realistic. They've got to be clearly defined. They've got to be measurable. Those are 3 big pieces. The objectives have to be things your client can actually do right now, or they could actually do by enacting the tactics you're suggesting, many of which could be maybe strategic partnerships. Clearly defined, and they have got to be measurable. So again, this is a snapshot of that chart we looked at previously. Going to really focus just on this part today. There's different types of objectives you can have. You can have those that talk about attracting, right? These are informational objectives. We usually know them to be such because they start off with to raise awareness of. Maybe you're trying to change the way people act or feel. Now we're trying to change their attitudes or their behaviors, right? And that's going to take on different language. It's going to speak about certain actions, right? Or feelings or attitudes that folks may have. Maybe you're trying to change the tone of public opinion, or maybe you're trying to get people to donate more. 2 examples there. On strategies, a very important thing here. Again, objectives are more specific, goals are more broad, strategies are more broad, tactics are more specific. Strategies talk to us about the way you are going to go about achieving your objective. You can see here, oftentimes strategies can be confusing because they're intangible. They're ideas, they're concepts, right? Some great words that people use to write their strategies, words like leverage, highlight, focus, initiate, start, build, right? Those are broad, but they speak to approaches you can take. And again, here comes that very critical acronym when you're creating your objectives. It's got to be specific, it's got to be measurable, it's got to be attainable, it's got to be relevant, and most importantly, it has to be time-bound. Okay, we have to know over what period of time are you trying to focus on getting this job done. Anybody have any questions so far? Okay, we'll carry on. Let's take a closer look at theme and message. Where goals are broad, the theme is broad. Here, the theme is the overarching idea that applies to all of your audiences, all of your publics included. For example, maybe you're Volkswagen creating a public relations campaign after your emissions crisis scandal, right? The theme of that campaign is one of attrition, right? We're sorry. We want to do things better. We want to make it right, right? So that theme is kind of the bow that wraps it all together. And in this case, the theme has to be consistent through all forms of your communication, right? If people interact with your campaign, they've got to get the same feeling, the same sense. But what changes a little bit is the messaging to each of those different publics, right? The message is the basic idea that you want the public to remember as a result of interacting with your campaign. An example here is, again, maybe that Volkswagen campaign is about saying we're sorry, right? But you're going to say that a little differently to customers that stuck with you than those who potentially left, or those customers who you may want to buy from you, but are hesitant to do so for the first time because of that crisis. Again, you're still saying sorry, but the message is going to be a little bit different in terms of how you communicate that. Again, the difference between theme and message here, where goal is broad and objective is specific, where strategy is broad and tactic is specific, theme is broad, message is specific. And particularly when you're looking at your key messages of your campaign, they should relate to your primary publics. If you have messaging in your campaign that does not relate to a primary public, or you have a primary public that has no messaging directed towards them, something is wrong, because your campaign is built for your primary publics first, and everybody else comes thereafter. Do you have any questions on the relationship between theme and messaging? Okay. Let's move now then to channels and strategies. So essentially now you've got your goal in place, you've got your objectives set, you have an idea of how you want to approach this, right? You know what the campaign's about, you know what the reason for the campaign is, the theme, and you've got your publics in mind, and you've got your messaging in place, right? You know what you want to say to them. Well, now the question becomes where, when, and how, right? When, where, and how. We already know why, right? But now it comes down to when, where, and how. And when discussing these things, right, you are now seeing the shift from putting it on a map to thinking about enacting it, right? From map to enact in person. This is where that transition happens. So first things first is you've got to think about what communication channels are going to benefit you here. How do you decide that? It all really comes down to your publics. Who are your primary publics, right? What type of media channels do they expose themselves to? What type of non-media channels do they expose themselves to? What type of interactive media channels do they expose themselves to? We'll talk more about these groups over the next couple of weeks. And then you look towards strategies, right? Once you know this information, right, what media, what non-media, what interactive media channels your client uses, now the question is, well, how do I go about taking advantage of that information? And now we come up with our strategies, right? Or we develop our approach, right? So strategy, again, is a very broad umbrella term, if you will, and it refers to other decisions made on how the program will be implemented, right? So now I know what channels my publics use. I know what I need to say. How do I go about doing it? Again, strategies are a concept. Tactics are the actual actions that you take. We're going to hold this event tactic. We're going to do a publicity campaign amongst this media tactic, right? Those are the actions you're taking to help complete that strategy choice that you made. Does anybody have any questions between the difference of channels and strategies? Does anybody have any question between the difference of channels and strategies? Okay, we'll carry on. Here's an example, because a lot of times students get very confused with the difference between strategies and tactics, and that's okay because it happens in the real world all the time too. So let's talk about it now. Let's make sure we all are on the same page. So if you look at it, all right, let's go to point 2. During this planning phase, when you're thinking about how you're going to approach the challenge of working towards your objectives, or you as a team are asking yourselves, what can you build or take advantage of that already exists, and how are we going to do it? Those are all strategic questions. In the real world, your strategy may describe the different types of diplomatic, psychological, philosophical approaches, or the themes and appeals you're going to use. Fear, logic, humor, right? And the messaging you'll convey. It's likely you may have several strategies for an objective, and some strategies may serve several objectives, and that's okay. Here's some examples: media relations, third-party endorsements, and public engagement. Again, very broad terms that speak about the approaches you may take. Great words here that signify a strategy: leverage, utilize, employ, build, facilitate, embark on, highlight. Again, these broad terms, which you can give more specific examples of with your tactics. I want to focus here on these 2 points. You will probably have several strategies for an objective, and some strategies may serve several objectives. Again, for your campaigns, you should have 2 to 4 and no more than 5 objectives. You should have 2 goals: a business goal and a PR goal. The campaign is being built to achieve the PR goal. You should have 3 distinct strategies for your campaign this semester. Again, 3 distinct strategies. For those 3 distinct strategies, something we'll talk more about next week, you should have at least 6 individual tactics, one of which should be a special event. Special event does not mean something you necessarily have to get tickets for. We'll talk more about that next week. But again, your campaign's got 2 goals. I want you to focus on the PR goal. Your campaign's got 3 to 5 objectives, no more than 5. Your campaign has 3 strategies minimum, and your campaign has 6 different tactics minimum. Those tactics, of which one should be a special event. And when you're looking at how to do all this, right, you ask yourself, well, that's a lot going on. Look at it from the integrated approach. How do we bring these individual pieces together to make the whole? Again, your strategies should come from deciding how you're going to work together using multiple channels. Your strategies should be born out of the question of, well, how are we using PASO? Paid, earned, shared, owned. Those 4 different media types. You want to make sure that whatever strategies you have, that they can reach multiple targets and they can bridge any gaps that exist. In other words, the more flexible your strategies are, the more beneficial they'll be. Right? The more you can get done, with one strategy, the better off you'll be in terms of timing, in terms of budget, in terms of resources, and in terms of being efficient. You'll notice here, different campaigns are more beneficial than others. What I really want you to do at this point of our class, if you haven't done it yet, is go to the appendix in your textbook and look at pages 236 to 245. They are fantastic. They give you such great resources to work with and great ideas you can pull from. If you don't look at that part of your textbook this semester, you're really not getting your money's worth from it, and I hope that you do. I know it's not the cheapest textbook out there, but if anybody is a PR person in the future, this is one you definitely should keep and hold on to if you can. But use the appendix section, again, pages 236 to 245, to help your teams get those ideas flowing. So choosing your channel, we talked about it, right? PASO. paid, earned, shared, owned. When you're thinking about your strategies and you're thinking about your tactics this semester, ask yourself, which one of the 4 media types does it fall into? And again, we've talked about this before. I would be shocked if your campaign did not utilize earned media and owned media, as well as likely shared media. If your campaign has the budget or the creative ways to be able to utilize paid media as well, go for it. Go for it. But certainly expecting to see owned and earned as well as shared in a 2020 world. And if paid also exists, wonderful. And always when you're looking at that PASO model, keep in mind of this area here, right? It's where multiple different media types overlap each other. That's called converged media. And that would speak about the different types of media or opportunities that exist in public relations, that you can utilize that will help you benefit multiple areas. Again, that middle area where you see more than one of these items overlapping. Does anybody have any question on choosing the right channel? And again, these
Yes.
are, yes, go ahead.
Could we please go over that? Like, what is the best way to choose the right channel? Because I was studying the PESO model, but
Yep.
I was a little bit confused on how to use it.
Sure. So these are options. These are all different options for you. And you will see that there's 4 distinct groups. You've got paid media, which is oftentimes advertising. You can see examples here. You have earned media, which is getting publicity, right, from third-party media. You've got shared media, which is always going to be that social media engagement and interaction. And you've got owned media, which is going to be content that comes from you.
Hello?
Or your fans or followers.
I can't hear you.
We're still here. Can you hear us, Liz? So with the owned media, right, you will notice that, let's go back. There we go. Sorry, folks. With owned media, you can see this is all content that's being brought to you solely from the client or content you're helping the client develop, right? So in choosing your channel, that's going to come down to what type of public you're trying to reach, what type of media, what type of non-media, what type of interactive. Hello, folks. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can
Yes,
hear
now I
Yeah, so it
yeah.
seems to me that my wireless might have dropped for a moment, but I think I'm back. So just bear with me for a second for me to be able to get my resources back. I can get some cool headphones like that. Liz. I'm telling you, those are pretty neat. If I had headphones like that, I'd go outside and take my class, right? Keep my ears on. Let me just find my slides here, and we'll go back. Give me one quick second.
It keeps all the noise away, so I
Yeah,
can
no,
focus.
I understand, and we live in noisy times. So let's see here. Give me 1 second to share my screen with you all again, and we should be able to pick up right where we left off. That was fun, right? That was a real 2020 thing, right? Who knows what's going to happen? All of a sudden, something happens, and you say, "Oh my God, what did we do there?" All right, so let's see. Can you folks see my screen?
Yeah, we
All
were
right.
there. Yeah.
Back to PASO. So so these 4 different media types, right? Paid media, advertisements, earned media, publicity, shared media, social media engagement, owned media, any content that exists from your client or content that you help them create. The idea here, Liz, to answer your question is, how do we know what channel? You got to go back to your publics and you have to figure out what type of media, what type of non-media, and what type of interactive media, we'll talk more about those terms, they utilize, they prefer, they open themselves up to. Once you know that, you can look at this chart and start to decide how you're going to utilize these different media types. And you can see that some of these points, for example, incentive exists where paid and owned overlap. You know, if I was able to maybe start a brand ambassador program, that would really help me, because not only would I be able to capitalize on owned media, but I could also capitalize on paid media. So I've got 2 different media types working for me as channels, help me with one specific strategy here. So that's what they mean by looking at the areas where media converges to see if there's an opportunity that can kind of really give you double the amount of impact. But again, you can't make these decisions until you know who your publics are, number one, and number two, you know what their media preferences are. That is critical. Moving on from there, let's talk about what those media channels are. So they are oftentimes associated with broad dissemination through print and broadcast media, essentially very likely the media outlets that you and I and the entire world have been using the last 24 hours or so to track the ongoing 2020 presidential election and its results. We're likely talking about the news media. We're talking about institutional advertising as well, something called donated media. A lot of times that's beneficial for nonprofits. Non-media channels would be those events, those community programs, community relations, community involvement, philanthropy programs, philanthropic initiatives, or any type of in-person communication, a speech, let's say, right, or maybe a webinar, and direct mail. These are things that are done to be able to connect with people in mass, but not use the media. Last but not least, you have interactive media, no surprises here, social media, blogs, the internet, and email. So these are the three different media types that exist for you as a PR pro, right, in terms of the different channels. Now, once you know your publics, you'll know if they prefer turning to the news media or if they prefer only really seeing what happens in their community based upon information they trust. Or maybe they really spend a lot of time on social media, but don't use the news media. Maybe they use the news media equally as much as they use social media, but they really prefer in-person communication over those two. And knowing these things will help you make decisions. And then based upon the decisions you make, you can decide which of the four media types, paid, earned, shared, or owned, you should be using to reach that public. In other words, when you're looking at this part of your campaign, you're essentially using the preferences of your publics to decide your communication strategies and tactics towards those publics. That's where the research really comes in. And you'll know that any of these three you pick, they have their own different types of tactics. We'll talk more about that. And I do hope it answers your question. You know, when you look at strategies, much where the theme ties all of the campaign together in terms of messaging, right? The strategy really ties all of your tactics together. And it's key here because your tactics are what your clients are paying for, right? That's what they think they're getting. They don't realize all this work you're doing on the front end. So strategy development really involves a deep understanding of publics. Bottom line, get to know your clients' people, particularly the ones you want this campaign to reach. Know who else is out there trying to communicate the same or similar messaging to these groups of people. And make sure you can make really clean, crisp, smart decisions on what channels or what types of communication, not you want to use, but that your desired publics need you to use because they prefer it. It really comes down to the publics in this part of the course. When choosing which communication channels to use, be mindful of a couple things. Number one, who your client is and their resources. Number two, who their overall audiences are, as well as who you think their audiences should be for the campaign. Look at the time that's available to you, and more importantly, the time that's available to your client, right? Last week, we looked at just how big or lack thereof sometimes communication teams can be, and be realistic about what you're suggesting your client could and should do. As a bonus, don't turn, quote, a blind eye to channels that offer two-way communication because, you know, now more than ever before, people want to be able to provide feedback. They want to have a conversation. They want to be heard. And a lot of times, if you pay close enough attention to that, you may find out some really insightful things, particularly from those folks who may have even the most negative of two-way communication with you. Even though you may not agree at their tone or their temperament, there's probably a reason why they feel that way. And it's still important to listen. Right? So realize that any channel you create, there's always going to be a desire for feedback from those who are receiving it, and it can be very valuable to you. Here's an example. A strategy for a nonprofit like yours may be to partner with a media organization, right? And the question now becomes, well, why is that, right? Here it is. By creating that partnership, many newspaper and broadcast outlets have what's known as community service policies. They also exist to be able to serve the communities of their readers and the communities that they exist in. So knowing this, these policies can be utilized, right, in a way in which you can then ask them to sponsor community events, maybe community events held by your organization, as well as provide you with free levels of publicity and news coverage of the event. And a lot of times this is going to happen at the more local level, but that's okay because that's the type of clients that you're dealing with. So this is a great potential publicity enhancing tactic you could utilize. It all comes down to deciding between you and your teammates what the right approach is, right? What makes successful PR strategies, deciding on the message, deciding on the medium or the channel, right? And then asking yourself, how do you want to say it? Tone. When do you want to say it? Timing. For example, anybody who's communicating right now about something aside from the election is probably going to get lost. It is all anyone is thinking about right now, whether they may admit it or not. It is on the news 24/7, and we're all left currently in suspense, right? So again, the value in strategic thinking is very important here because strategic thinking and a strategically built campaign comes down to two things: focusing on your publics and making sure everything you are doing is helping you get closer to achieving your objective. If messaging, if media types, if channels decided don't help you reach your audience, I have no idea why you're including them in your campaigns. If your campaign is got a lot of great ideas, a lot of good tactics, but doesn't have objectives they can relate back to, I don't know why we're including them. The objectives and the publics are going to really lead the way for your campaigns this semester. Here's an example. Right? You're going to see this in your campaign draft booklet, right? So it's going to ask you to list the strategy. So there you could say, right, we leverage, highlight, spotlight, whatever. And then underneath it, I want you to list the objective or objectives that it helps achieve. And if there's more than one, that's great. But if there's none, we shouldn't have it, right? So I want you to start being able to think with this mindset. If the strategy does not help get an objective done, why do we have it included? If it helps us achieve more than one objective, wonderful. Let's put it down. Look at your client and ask yourself, what do we have to work with? There's an article I'm going to bring you next week from Coin PR about the value of time. And that speaks about, there is plenty of days, weeks, months of awareness locally, nationally, internationally that you could always utilize. There are certain important days and times in history you can reference, right? There's a whole concept called news jacking or headline jacking in terms of how can you tie your client into more largely discussed news items of the day or of our current time, right? So these are all things that exist out there as strategies you can utilize. But one thing we shouldn't overlook is your client, right? What resources does your client have at its disposal? Sure, I know they're smaller to regional nonprofits, right? But what do they have at their fingertips? What's newsworthy for them? For anyone who's taken a journalism class before, right? What's newsworthy at your fingertips? Well, ask yourself, what makes something newsworthy? Well, is it legitimately new? A lot of times we say the most innovative thing, right? But if your last 3 advertising campaigns have said the most innovative, but it's the same product with just small modifications, well, that's not true. And the media is one of the most sophisticated publics you can deal with. So good luck trying to get that past them. So is it truly new? We are always enamored with celebrity. Even though their show seems to be ending, the Kardashians are still often at top of mind. Although we could also argue that their initial fame and fortune and careers into the influencing space have also created opportunities for a lot of other people to fill that void. And sometimes we talk more about them than we used to talk about the Kardashian clan. Is it important to many? Is there conflict? Is there mystery? Is there suspense? Is there something top secret or confidential or for your eyes only, right? How big are the consequences? If your news item was a rock and we dropped it into a pond, how big and how far would the ripples go? Is it something funny, romantic, sexy? Is there a certain appeal? These are things that really enhance the newsworthiness of your client. And that's important because if you're going after earned media, one of the 4 media types, it has to be newsworthy. And the more items you can check off this list here, new, novel, celebrity, important, conflict, top secret, significant, right, the different appeals, the more of these you can check off the list, the more newsworthy your client may potentially be. But just because it's newsworthy doesn't mean the story is going to get told, right? It has to be ready to go in terms of the content, the availability, and there's got to be a relationship there. The fact of the matter is there's 3 million plus people today that are still conducting public relations activities, and they're all scratching and clawing for the same amount of media coverage. What's going to make your story or your pitch different from theirs? It's likely going to be that list we just looked at. And when I say ready to go, what I'm saying is if a reporter says, yes, we want to do this story, they probably mean right now, if not relatively soon, and they're going to need a lot of stuff from you. A press release is just the beginning. But one of the things you can also do is if the client's story isn't always beneficial right now, the client's expertise, their knowledge, their opinion can be. And that's when we potentially pitch our clients as subject matter experts. There's likely no better person to talk to about the needs of childhood cancer pediatric research than an organization like With Purpose, you can look them up, who excel in that area in terms of raising research and donation dollars. They know what they're talking about. So they could certainly be a subject matter expert for the media to utilize. In other words, somebody whose quotes and knowledge matter. Maybe you can provide imagery, visuals, video, photo, infographics. Maybe there's data or a research report that you've done or a survey that your client recently did, some type of insights or findings they want to share. Maybe their vision or their narrative as an organization is now more important than ever before. For any organization that exists to expel fake news and correct misinformation, they're likely very sought after these days, right? Or maybe there's some type of authority they have based upon who they are and how long they've been around. When you look to the competition, you've got to get real about this, right? There are going to be competitors for your clients. And with competition comes external challenges. You'll know that from your SWOT analysis that you're all working on. So the big thing to do here to work this out is find a way to draw upon your clients' experiences or their ideals, right? What they believe to be true. Utilize that to your advantage. Use that to differentiate your client, right? Avoid what everybody else is doing. We've all been there. We've done that. And try to find a way to put the people first. Right? If you put your people first, right, the public you're trying to reach out to, it will make a difference. Somebody really can tell when a presenter gives a speech that they are an expert on, but that they're giving to that particular audience versus a presenter who gives the same speech to every audience, no matter who's sitting in the seats. And we always say be memorable. If you follow the advice we're talking about, you will be, because you're going to find a way to connect with people at the individual level. And obviously, find what your clients' strengths are as an organization. Don't beat them up about the weaknesses. Be honest about them, know what they are. But you have to play to organizational strengths. Know where you're strong and be the strongest there. And sure, knowing what your weaknesses are is a strength.
I think we lost them again, right?
Folks, can you still hear me? Hello, folks. Are you still there? I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes.
There it is. I see Jade is holding court here. He's gone. No, he's back. That's 2 strikes. Let's see if I can make it to the 3rd one. All right, hold on a second. Let me get my screen back here. How annoying that is, right? Oh, I'm gonna call my internet provider after this class, and I'm gonna just be very angry and sad at them. So, and you folks should do it too. You folks call Optimum and you complain to them and say, "Professor needs his internet. What are you guys doing?
Optimum.
Wasting our time."
Yeah.
Yeah, don't get
I
Optimum.
used to have a Optimum, but I switched to
No,
Verizon.
I wish we don't have any other options here. So let me see. Let me share my screen. Try this for a 3rd time. You folks are patient. You're wonderful people. Let's get back to this here. And hopefully I can figure out a way to cancel Optimum. Okay. So getting back to what we were talking about here. All right. Bottom line here, know your organization's strengths. Okay. Play to them. All right. Find a way to make the strengths work while being aware of the weaknesses. Coming back to this about the media, the facts are facts, right? So some things that are really interesting to know as you make decisions over the next month. Although audiences report receiving the majority of their information from TV, they retain much more from newspapers and magazines. Why? They require more involvement. Print media is better for logical appeals. If you want to let information lead your persuasive efforts, maybe print media is the way to go. Broadcast media, though, is better for emotional appeals. If you want to let heartstrings, right, pull on the audiences you're trying to reach, maybe it's broadcast, TV, radio, local, regional, state, national. That's a better way to go, right? But you and I both know whether it's building a PR campaign or turning to a presentation, right? Logic appeals or emotional appeals, they don't work alone. They work together. The question really is which one just takes the lead here, right? So print media is better for generating a call to action, but broadcast media is better at providing information. So if you follow me on this, if we're trying to inform to educate and educate to persuade, I can kind of really see that broadcast media leading to print media formula starting to come into picture. Right now, there's a lot of change, as I'm sure you all know. But the bottom line is the most successful PR campaigns are those that blend traditional media, broadcast, print, with interactive and social media. Not that they have campaigns that utilize both, but campaigns that utilize both together at the same time, working off of each other. And we see this all the time in TV shows we watch or things we read. They direct us to go online or to social media to continue the conversation or share our thoughts and things of that nature. So it happens. Let's take a close look at newspapers. Right. It's true that circulation numbers have fallen and they continue to do so. But newspapers remain very influential for college-educated, middle to higher income people, if that's the audience you're trying to reach. Circulation speaks to how many people come in contact with the newspaper one time. Keep in mind, it's much easier to get coverage at the non-national level, which could benefit many of your clients, particularly those that are really focusing on local media. The more local the media, the more likely the opportunity. Advertising costs much more, paid media, when it's in national versus non-national newspapers. But make no mistake, newspapers are still pervasive, right? They still reach out and connect with audiences. There is likely somewhere in the neighborhood of 450 million newspapers sold daily in the United States. Now, that may have changed a little bit since we all are currently in this quarantine space we live in, but on average, by and large, that's the number you're looking at on a daily basis. There's something called a pass-along rate. That will tell you that for every person of the 450 million who purchased that newspaper, right, they can likely give that newspaper to 2.2 people, which means you're looking at a total of nearly 990 million total people daily coming in contact potentially with that one newspaper. Magazines, right? What do? They give you the ability to target specific audiences, right? And that's very, very, very appealing. And publicity attempts here are looked at more favorably, and advertising costs less. However, one of the drawbacks is long lead times. In other words, magazines take a while to come out, but the benefit is if you are in that magazine, the shelf life is longer. If you're in a daily newspaper, the newspaper is here today and gone tomorrow. Trade publications, like PR Week, for example. Every industry and every profession likely has its own publication or trade journal. Nonprofit Times, for example, exists for nonprofits. And this is a very highly cost-effective way to do business because advertising rates are very low and audiences are very targeted. But you've got to ask yourself, are you trying to reach a very targeted industry-specific audience, or are you trying to reach a much more broader general interest audience? And that'll help you make some of these decisions. Bottom line, whether it's trade publications, magazines, or newspapers, you should read past issues, several past issues, to really understand how to pitch your client to get that publicity before you ever send that email or make that first phone call. TV. It's all about access. 99% of US households have at least one TV. TV sets today in the United States are turned on for approximately 7.5 hours a day. And it's likely that number has gone up based on how much time you and I are all spending at home. And 1/3 of all TV viewers watch cable in prime time, right? Which is a very, very key thing to note. Again, TV is very effective for making emotional appeals, even at the local public access TV level. For example, TV 34 in Union, if you will, right? And here's something key. The link between TV viewing and purchasing habits is stronger than the link between newspaper reading and purchasing. So if you want people to make an action from seeing something to engaging with it, TV tends to be more beneficial. But the retention is quite low, right? So people retain more by reading the news than watching it. But when they watch the news, they have a tendency to potentially act more, right? But if you think about it, when you and I are watching TV, a lot of times it's not the process, it's part of the process. This is just frustrating, folks. I've tried something else now. Hopefully this works. Hopefully you're still with me. Hopefully you're getting something out of today's lecture. It is a really important lecture if you want to get through this. I'm now using my iPhone as a personal hotspot. I've totally cast aside Optimum. Hopefully this serves as a way to help us. So sharing my screen with you once more. Bear with me here as I want to be able to continue to move through this with you. And for anybody who watches this back on YouTube later on or on our class, I'm sure we'll get a couple of good laughs out of this. But this is some serious stuff, so I want to make sure I talk to you about it. So some of the stats we left off with is the fact of the matter is TV is appealing, but it's usually part of the process. It's not the process in its entirety. All right. It's also key to know that TV does not have nearly the same appeal when you are looking at different educational levels for the public you're trying to reach. In fact, there's a lack of appeal here when it comes to highly educated audiences. And that term really means those folks potentially with a master's degree or higher. Again, this really comes down to why you need to know your audience as best you possibly can. Radio. I don't know if any of you are thinking about this, but it certainly is an option. Radio news consistently outperforms everyone else when it comes to accuracy and thoroughness. In a time like this where we live with fake news and misinformation, who wouldn't want that? Particularly when it comes to issues, which it's likely a lot of you and your organizations are built upon. Radio is very pervasive. You can see this, 98% of households own at least one radio. The average listener is spending 3.25 hours a day listening. Right? And there's also a very high appeal to youth audiences. And however, think about this, right? Timing also plays a role to radio's benefit. At certain times of the day, you and I are tuning in very mass levels, maybe commuting back and forth to work. in unquarantined times. And there's certain shows or programs we can tune into, I should say, right? But we know that radio cannot cover the visual stories, obviously, as well as other mediums. And there is that ongoing battle now of not just terrestrial radio, AM, FM, and satellite radio, but now podcasting, right? You and I could turn to podcasts and listen to them before I ever listen to satellite radio, and I can listen to satellite radio before I ever listen to terrestrial radio, AM, FM. Why would you use radio? Well, we can look at some answers here, but more importantly, you've got to decide if the radio is a medium in which your clients prefer. If the answer is yes, now we've got to figure out how to work this into our campaign. If the answer is no, maybe we leave it out for this particular version. The internet and social media. You and I both know this is going to play a huge role. Some truths about social media we talked about a lot last week. We'll talk about them briefly now. Rule number 1, social media is not cheap. You and I know that. It's free to show up, but it costs time, a lot of people hours to be able to stick around. And it's going to take money to be able to really raise the level of visibility for your social media platforms online. It takes expertise to design social media campaigns and keep them going and get the engagement that you're looking for. And you and I know that sometimes it takes a long time, if at all, to quote unquote go viral, although all your clients are going to want to do that. Social media campaigns also too cannot always be done in-house. Right? So it really is important for you to think more deeply about what your client wants social media to be able to do for them before making that decision whether or not it makes sense to jump right in right now. And this really brings us to a close on the first half of the conversation I was hoping to have with you today. I know that was a little abruptly interrupted several times, judging upon my Wi-Fi issues. So I do apologize with you all for that. Want to come back to you now for a moment here if I can. There we go. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second and come back to our chat here. Does anybody have any questions about things we talked about? We just talked about a lot, and like I said, we had several interruptions in between. Anything you want to clarify in terms of goal, objective, strategy, tactic, theme and message, channels and strategies, channels or media types? Any questions you folks may have?
I have a question, but it wasn't pertaining to those things. It was something else that was mentioned in the discussion.
Sure. Well, I have a question for you, Jada. Any suggestions on how to reach my cable provider, my internet provider? Do you have any tips on that?
I have no idea. None whatsoever. I apologize.
All right. So aside from that, what do you got?
When you were mentioning radio, does that include podcasts, or is that like something on its own island?
That's something on its own. Those stats do not speak to podcasting, but podcasting has exploded. And it's been around for a while. I think it's been around longer than the growth we're seeing now, but everything has its time, and we definitely live in the age of podcasting being a real big thing. But like anything, once something gets really big, a lot of people kind of flood and it gets a little crowded. So, I think one of the first podcasts a lot of people trace back to is Serial, and definitely NPR has been really big in this space, and many others have capitalized on it. But no, radio would come down to terrestrial, AM, FM, or satellite radio. But podcasting would be something different, but definitely a competitor in that space. You're welcome. You're welcome. Does anybody else have any questions? All right, so I know we're already at 3:20, and in the absence of time, we'll see if we can get to taking a secondary look at our discussion questions today. We may not get there, but we'll try. What I did want to transition to before we ran out of time today was a really important conversation we should have, pending my Wi-Fi connection holding up, and that would be about public opinion. So I can certainly go on and on and on, but I kind of get bored with that, and I'm sure you all do too. How would you describe it, right? If somebody says to you, the court of public opinion, or as public opinion sways, it's a very intangible thing. How would you describe it? How would you describe the concept of public opinion? What is it? What is it not? What are your folks' thoughts on that? Open question in the room.
Well, that's a really broad question.
Yeah.
When it comes to public opinion, is more so like how people are feeling now, in the moment. And it could be affected by so many things. Like, for example, my favorite fast food could be affected by my opinion on politics right now.
That's fair.
Like, there's so many different things that coincide with it. It doesn't have to do anything. It doesn't have anything to do specifically with anything that may have to connect with it. So
interesting. That's a really, really interesting point you made, Farhan. I would agree. Other folks have thoughts on this. Jade is chiming in here. Fast thoughts for a particular moment in time, relying on trends. Fair enough. Fair enough. Some of you may say that public opinion tends to be very, very fickle. And I think a lot of times is, I don't know if you folks have ever taken a ride down the parkway, for anybody who's lived in Jersey a long time, but as the further south you get, you start to see those plants that we call them cattails. They're kind of on the side of the highway there, and they're just they're kind of like this. And it's not until a really strong breeze comes through that they kind of get rustled a little bit and they start to move and come alive. And then every so often they kind of just settle and they kind of fall back to place. And sometimes it seems that public opinion can kind of be that way. A lot of times you and I are stationary. We're in our own moments, and something comes along where it rustles some of us, and we start to kind of become awake and become alive and become aware of what's going on. And other times, right, that may not be the case. And just because the breeze blows through, not every cattail moves. Sometimes those folks, or I shouldn't say those folks, those cattails that aren't affected or the breeze doesn't reach, they just kind of stay stationary until the next time. And that's one of those analogies I always think about when we talk about this subject. But Farad, I think you hit it on the head, and it's really difficult because in this profession you are being asked to not only understand what public opinion is, but also find a way to be able to not just understand it and communicate it to your client, but find a way to shape it, to affect it. And that's a really powerful skill set. So what I am hoping we can do prior to the end of today is to have this conversation about public opinion. And I think that having it with the backdrop of the ongoing presidential election is just very timely and very appropriate. So let's dive into this. All right. When you talk about public relations, you and I are doing business in the marketplace of ideas. We exist where communication, society, technology collide. But our currency really is ideas. A lot of what we do is based upon trying to find a way to make the intangible tangible, right? And when we're doing that, this concept of ideas really comes down to this, right? What's the key here? Is this what I want them to remember? And that's what you should ask yourself about the messaging you're creating. You get one shot, one chance to speak, quote unquote, to your publics. What would you say to them to have the effect you're looking to have? Because not only do you want them to remember it, but by them remembering it, are they going to act in such a way that it's going to get your client what they want, right? And ways in which we do this is we love to be able to have these types of conversations one-to-one. But even in a non-pandemic world, sometimes getting this type of FaceTime is very hard to do these days, increasingly hard to do. And instead of looking like that, a lot of times it looks like this. And if you've ever been familiar with playing this old game of telephone, right? Not only are we doing it digitally now, and maybe this is a great image to really summarize all that 2020 has been, at least most of it. The old game of telephone is a lot of times whatever way the conversation started in the beginning is likely not the way it ends. And that's very dangerous because you and I are trying to find a way to have a very succinct conversation to get to the same place where we started at, which is getting people informed, educated, and eventually persuaded. So, relying on this game of digital telephone sometimes can be a little challenging, to say the least. And when we go through these processes, right, even at this moment, The goal really is to hit the target, right? And that target is to transition from informing to educate and educating to persuade, essentially having the people not just remembering your message, but acting in the way, right, or changing in the way in which your client wants them to. And when that happens, that idea has been exchanged. The intangible becomes tangible. A prime example, at one point in time, there was only one person in the world, Albert Einstein, who knew what E equals mc squared meant, right? He could only see it, and it was up to him to be able to communicate it, right? Explain it, present it, prove it in such a way, his hypothesis, that it became real. It became scientific fact, right? That the light bulb went off in everybody else's head, not just his. So when we look at this, we've got to really think about this in terms of two pieces. Number one, as communicators, whatever messaging you come up with, you've got to decide, is it appropriate for the audiences you're reaching out to? And just because it's appropriate, does it have meaning, right? If it fits the audience, but it doesn't really say anything, it's not going to be memorable. And if it's not memorable, there's no chance for the audience to understand it. And if the audience never understands it, they're never going to believe it. But the prime goal for any messaging is not just to be understood, it's to be believed, right? So whatever messaging you're building for your clients this semester, you have to ask yourself, how do we find a way to make the public believe it, right? Separately, you can get your message out there to a lot of people, exposure, that's wonderful. But did you disseminate it correctly? And if you disseminated it correctly and you got it out to a lot of people, that's wonderful. But did they accept it? Did they believe it as true? And if they believed it as true, did it have the desired effect? What is your messaging setting out to do? It's setting to change attitude. It's setting to change behavior. Your messaging has to be a change agent. If it's not, then we're not going nearly as far as our campaign could. Your campaign should be built in such a way that you're informing your publics, you're educating them, and then they will choose to respond by persuading, right? That change in attitude, that change in behavior. So how are decisions influenced? This is really important because essentially the conversation we're having right now is what your clients are hoping you are going to be able to help them create a roadmap to do. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stages. The awareness stage. How is awareness raised? It's raised through the media, through advertisements, so earned media, paid media, and electronic word of mouth or shared media. Once that happens, then people transition from inform to educate, right? They see a value. When they see a value, they get an interest, right? And in this part, what happens? They turn to people in their lives, individuals, right? They turn to their reference groups. Who do they turn to for advice? Who's their friends? Who's their families? Who's their coworkers, their colleagues, right? They look for more information and they start to engage with content and they make a decision, right? It's at that point where they reach the evaluation, the trial, and the adoption stages that they're engaging with your message. They're transitioning from education to potentially persuasion. Who do they turn to here? Again, now it's not just about them, it's about those reference groups. It's about their own experience, and they're seeking out credible sources. And when all this comes together, you now start to see how these decisions are influenced. But in order for the decision to be influenced, like we said, the message has to be believed. That comes down to two things. Who is your source? And are the variabilities of believability in play? So number one, whoever is the spokesperson, right? Whoever is the face, the voice for your client, can they, will they, should they be believed, right? So you've got to really put forth knowledgeable experts. A lot of organizations may go with their CEO, but does their CEO know? If the CEO doesn't know what he or she is talking about, that's a poor choice. Variabilities and believability, some key things to note here. Several things we can talk about. Number one, the sleeper effect. Over time, people can separate an uncredible source from a credible message. However, what I would tell you is, who has that time anymore? Many don't. So you have got to not hope the audience will be patient enough to get it, right? You've got to make sure it's incredibly clear up front that they get it. And part of that is choosing the right source. The context of the message, right? What environment, in what way, in what channel perhaps, what media type have you chosen to communicate the message? And realize you and I live in a day and age now where actions speak louder than words. Don't just tell me, show me. And don't just show me once, show me over and over again. Again, we live in an age now where it's not just, is what I'm seeing accurate and real? We have to ask ourselves, is it true, right, before we ever then buy into it? And realize too that the audiences, the publics you reach out to, are going to have predispositions about your client. You know, some of your clients have been around for a long time. You need to know how the clients, publics already think and feel about them. You may not agree, your client may not agree, but you need to know what they are to be able to make better, faster, smarter, stronger decisions here and for your client. Going back a slide there. For anyone who's taking psychology classes before, you've likely heard of cognitive dissonance. And this is why people get upset when their beliefs are challenged. And there's so many examples that we can utilize. Bottom line, a mental conflict occurs when beliefs are contradicted by new information. What you thought was real, true, or right, all of a sudden now is being brought into question. And the moment that question arises, an opportunity is created, right? The door is kind of opened just a little bit for the potentiality to have that person's mind be changed. Ways to do this: number one, circumstances have changed. Number two, there's new, perhaps scientific or logical developments. Or three, maybe you have an unexpected spokesperson. I would never think somebody would think or feel that way. Wow. And that shock kind of opens the door. Or maybe you found somebody who said no their entire life, and now they say yes. But keep in mind, even if you have all of these potentialities in play, selective exposure still exists. What does that mean? The public you're reaching out to every single moment of every single day have the ability to selectively choose what they do and what they don't expose themselves to. And you and I know that something that's going to be difficult to talk about or think about, we may think twice before we open ourselves up to it. So how you find a way to appeal to those publics is very important. Mass media in public opinion formation. It used to be that this three-piece approach, right? So the action occurs, the mass media covers it, you and I hear about it and we form our perceptions, and then we have some type of response. This used to be the way public opinion was formed. But what's one thing that's missing from this chart that's likely changed it drastically? Open question to our room here. What's one thing missing that likely has drastically changed this chart? For anyone who may be a little stumped, the answer looking for here would be social media. And we'll talk about it in just a moment. Right? You and I tend to turn to the mass media to help us create a trustworthy picture of the world beyond your own direct reach and your own experience. That is true, even in these times where we hear terms like fake news and we know so much misinformation exists online. And via the mass media, we know that PR pros are major players in forming public opinion. And that is so important in terms of why we're talking about it in class today. You and I are the people that often provide the mass media with information that, by and large, at least 50%, give or take, of their coverage comes from. So you and I play as much an equal role as the media in ethically forming public opinion. And where we once saw mass media, realize that we now see social media and its reach really falling into this equation and changing the game. What happens on social media really sometimes stems the mass media's coverage, as well as adding to it. So here's some food for thought. This comes from the Pew Research Center, one of the tools I suggested you consider using this semester to do your research, which again, at this point in November, you should be wrapping up your primary research. Your surveys, things like that should be wrapping up within the next week. After the last election in 2016, you will see some results. The public wants unbiased news. They're split on whether the news media can deliver it. And news use across social media platforms varied greatly. We also saw at that time that across America, attitudes were very divided, particularly in terms of what political affiliation you were with how they trusted or did not trust the news media. What else have we seen? We've seen that at that point, just 2 years ago, fewer Americans relied on TV news, and what type they watched varied based upon who they were. And you can see a stark decline in network and cable TV, but a rise, right? Still a decline, but a rise in the overall value of local TV coverage. Television news consumption varies most by age. You can see the breakdown of gender, of ethnicity as well, but the biggest gaps we see here demographically in terms of who does and who doesn't watch TV news based upon age. And you and I see here that it definitely trends in that 50 plus category. More Americans are turning to multiple social media sites for news today. They're leaving behind mass media. They're leaving behind broadcast. And now they're turning to social. About 1 in 4 now get news from multiple social media sites, and that number has likely increased exponentially since 2017. You can see here too that when looking at news from social media sites alone, other audiences also rely on multiple sites to do it. And you can see the breakdown here. Something to certainly note, people really seem to be beholden to Facebook, followed by Reddit and YouTube. Right? When you see people going to multiple sites, it's really Twitter, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, and then Facebook. Some differentials here. Interesting to note this. Bottom line here, many sites share news users with Facebook, with Twitter, with YouTube. And there's a big overlap in terms of users regarding news on Snapchat and Instagram. I would suggest all of you come back and take a look at some of these stats, as well as do some of your own research in this area once this lecture is posted online. What I wanted to call out to you actually today is this article that just came out over the weekend. And I really thought it was important to talk to you about today in class before our class was over. It comes from Time Magazine, and it's entitled, as you can see here, "The Misinformation Age Has Exacerbated and Been Exacerbated by the current pandemic we find ourselves in." And it really is interesting here, to note the truth is thinking critically, especially about the truth of a headline, reduces the spread of quote unquote fake news. And I pulled some quotes out here, and I'm talking to you. I know this is not a journalism class by any means, but I'm talking to you about this because it really seemed to be appropriate. Quote, The more emotional valence, right, or worth something we read online has, the likelier you or I are to pass it on, either to share it if it's something good, or to unburden ourselves if it's bad. And this really starts to speak to why we find this issue of misinformation. And I'm talking to you about this because it directly relates to how successful our PR efforts can be when we get real about just how much noise we have to cut through. Associate Professor David Rand at the MIT School of Management and a co-author on this study said, quote, research has shown that emotion makes people less discerning. In other words, once emotion takes the wheel, we start to become a little reckless with our thought process. You know, and truth be told, it seems here that fake news spreads faster on Twitter than truth. The reason, research found, was that lies, quote, were more novel than true news, and from them came fear, disgust, and surprise in the replies. And this oftentimes is just the thing that gives enough zing, enough surprise to spark that social media share, right, or shared media in the first place. And this is something that is very real and very now, and something we have to be aware of if we're using all these different mediums to be able to communicate with our intended publics. Something else I want to call out to you too is this, and it just so happens we're doing this lecture today. Political leanings also influence what's shared and not shared. Again, not saying anything about anyone's individual political affiliations, just telling you that overall political affiliations seem to play a role. A 2019 science study from researchers at Northeastern, Harvard, and SUNY Buffalo showed that neither the left, quote unquote, nor the right has a monopoly or a control or a majority on sharing fake news or real news. It turns out that both sides, more or less, equally mix fact and fiction quite regularly, right? So both are at fault. But just which fact and just which fiction an individual in either group may choose, however, was typically consistent with just which stories fit more comfortably with their own ideologies and affiliations. What does this basically mean? We live in a share crazy culture right now, and a lot of which is being shared is oftentimes now has to be questioned whether it's true or real, right? And too few of us are able to either tell or to stop and think about that. But more importantly, right, this is now in a territory where social media is all about sharing, and you have different pages you can choose to follow, friends you can choose to include in your feed, and it gets to that period of selective exposure where we really are starting to kind of close off all those things that don't align, that aren't familiar, they're not exactly the same, and it really just kind of becomes this self-serving stream, and you've got to be very careful here about that, because if that exists and you and I have this job to be able to inform and educate and persuade people, it becomes increasingly hard to cut through. For example, think about this. We live in a world of on-demand TV, where you and I can go on TV and choose to watch certain programs however we want to, whenever we want to. Right? But imagine if everything else on TV and all the other channels were taken away except for the ones that you liked. There's no variety, right? There's no diversity. Right? It only is one constant element, and that is very difficult, as well as very interesting to think about, particularly for communicators like yourselves who are getting ready to start your career, and in this class, building a campaign to try to cut through all that clutter and all that noise and connect with your publics, some of which who may not actually have you included in that kind of self-serving content stream right now. So what are we seeing? We're seeing the gap between television and online news consumption getting smaller. That's good. We're seeing the use of mobile devices for news and communication overall continuing to grow. Why am I talking to you about all this stuff? I'm hoping you can get knowledgeable about this and utilize it for your campaigns. We're seeing that older adults are driving the growth in mobile news use. Older adults are also continuing to adopt social media for the first time in larger numbers, and it is those younger adults who are adopting new cutting-edge social media channels at the fastest rate. 2/3 of Americans, 67%, get at least some news on social media. But what's on social media today? We just talked about it. A lot of misinformation, a lot of untruths, and a lot of news feeds that unfortunately are being driven by selective exposure. Non-Caucasian and those with less than a bachelor's degree increasingly say they get news on social media, sometimes only on social media. Many Americans believe that fabricated news is sowing confusion, and about a third, 32%, say they often see made-up political news online. Americans today have low trust in information from social media, but we turn to it quite often. Social media and direct visits to news organizations' websites are the most common pathway to online news today. Why does this make sense for you and I? Because we need to be able to utilize the news media to generate publicity for our clients, and we need to know the road potential readers or viewers travel to get there. Another truth: you can't escape the news. It really seems to be everywhere, so much so that sometimes folks have really turned into a negative opinion and are trying to find whatever they can do to get away from the news, right? Online news comes to you via emails, via alerts, via text from friends, from family, right? But it turns out that news that comes via emails and text, specifically from your friends or family, right? So it's kind of stamped with approval from somebody that you know. That's the type of news encounter that's most likely to result in a follow-up action. What does that tell us? That we're not just trying to persuade the audiences we're reaching to or communicate to the audiences we have included in our plan. We want to also include those secondary publics to make sure we amplify the likelihood of having the persuasive effort our clients intended us to. So to bring all this on home, folks, this is the definition of public opinion. Public opinion is the social process of forming, of expressing, and adjusting ideas that affect collective behaviors in situations. Public opinion is ongoing, it's ever evolving, it's ever changing, and everyone has a voice. Somebody once described it as adjusting ideas to people and people to ideas. And you now know that when you are trying to work through this process, right, you likely have three groups. Those that are with you, yes. Those that are against you, no. And those folks that are kind of ambivalent or undecided, they're the swayables that live in between. And what's the rules here? Keep as many as you have already. Gain as many as you can. Even if those folks aren't with you, try to find a way to at least gain their respect by presenting yourself as a noteworthy voice on the matter. Some truths to close out this conversation that we should all be aware of. Public opinion is very elusive and difficult to measure because the public tends to be passive. The collective expression of opinion of many individuals bound into one group, or the power of a very small but influential few. Either way, public opinion. It's formed by people who have some type of vested or self-interest in an issue. They specifically care about it. That's why they're getting involved. But realize that not everyone has the same interest in every issue. It's just a fact. Not everyone's going to be that cattail that gets blown back and forth by the wind on the Garden State Parkway. Sometimes the wind's not going to reach each one of those cattails, and they will get a chance to perhaps blow back and forth and get involved on another day. Individuals are seldom influenced by only one person. Research has shown that it oftentimes is those multiple layers, friends, family, and other reference groups, that play into the role of somebody ultimately being influenced. That's why your campaigns should have primary publics and secondary publics. And realize that by and large, you and I always find a way to form our opinions based upon our own self-interest. Sometimes, though, we're pushed to think about what our own self-interest is because some type of event happens. So if you want to start a conversation, it's better if something occurs, right, by and large, because that gets people thinking, right? You want to create some type of gust of wind to blow those cattails back and forth on the side of the road. You can see here that public opinion breaks down into 5 pieces. You know, is it the direction? Yes, no, pro, con, agree, disagree. Is it the intensity? How strongly people feel? Is it stability? How long people have felt that way? Is it the existing informational support? How much do we already know? Or is it the social support? Is it how you and I perceive other people and how they feel about the issue? These are all different dimensions of public opinion that play a role in helping the public form its opinion. And the key here, though, is when we talk about public opinion being formed, right, it comes down to individuals that make up that collective public, right? So there's got to be some definition of the issue. Activists or special interest groups get involved. There's some type of event, right? And then all of a sudden, once that event occurs, we see the involvement of opinion leaders, people who people whose opinions matter, right? Their voice has clout. And then because those opinion leaders start to speak about it, the media gets involved, they start to cover it, and all of a sudden it ends up on what's called the public agenda. It's on our TV screens, it's on the radio, it's in our newspapers, it's online, it's on social. So now we have this big level of public awareness. We're all talking about it. We're talking about it, we're discussing it, we're debating it, and all of a sudden we ask for something to happen. And we turn to those institutions, maybe the government, for example, and we ask for some type of resolution. And sometimes this happens quickly, sometimes this happens very slowly, and other times for so many valuable and valued issues, it's yet to happen, right? But there's that search for resolution, and at times where resolution can be reached, we get that resolution because those with authority make some type of statement and some type of action is taken. You and I know that some issues move through this process much quicker than others. And again, other issues still remain to have moved through the entirety of this process. And there's so many variables that play a role in that. And again, that's why public opinion is so difficult. But this is what you and I are expected to do. We're expected to understand how it's formed. We're expected to identify why the public holds that opinion, not agree with it, but understand how they arrive there. We're expected to communicate current public opinion to our clients. We're expected to find ways to be able to change undesirable opinions. Again, not agree with them, but understand them and then find ways to ethically work towards changing them. We're expected to inform the public. And then we're also expected to influence public opinion in the brand's favor. Bottom line, it is a tall task for us to be able to not only understand this, but influence it. But by understanding the nuances and the pieces of public influence, my hope is that you as students and teams can start to work towards doing that. So that brings a close to the conversation I wanted to have with you today, and I am glad that we were able to get through that a little bit easier as opposed to the first half of our class, and I do apologize for all those tech issues. But that being said, as I come back to you all now, we only get a chance to meet once a week. Does anybody have any questions about things we spoke about today?
Actually, I wanted to can you please repeat the life cycle of public opinion? I have definition of the issue and I missed the other
Sure.
3.
Sure. So it's going to be definition of the issue. Okay. Then opinion leaders get involved.
Okay.
Once the opinion leaders are involved, then we start to raise public awareness of the issue. Once the public at large starts to talk about it, then some type of institution involvement happens. Oftentimes it's the government, right? And then once the government or an institution is involved, we're all on the search for some type of resolution, some type of fix, right? Something has to happen. And again, that life cycle is short for some, longer for others, and not every issue has gotten a chance to successfully move through that life cycle yet. but that is the life cycle that we have.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. Do any of the folks have questions? Going once, going twice? Well, it's right up against 4 o'clock, so I don't want to keep you longer than I have to be. I know we went through this without a break, so I do appreciate you all continuing to stay online and to stay attentive. So a couple of quick things from me before I say good luck and stay well until next week. First and foremost, if you have yet to do so, please send me your second draft for your project as a team, and I can take a closer look at that. Separately, continuing to work to get feedback and grades back to you as quick as I can. More importantly, as we look towards our upcoming weeks, what I want to refer to you is week 10's discussion question is accessible underneath Unit 10. Please don't forget to engage with that question. We'll try to find a way to talk about the last couple of weeks' discussion questions as quickly as we can. The discussion question this week focuses on objectives, a lot of which we talked about today. In addition to that, please don't forget that as we transition towards next week, right, Unit 11, if you can believe it already, Unit 11 will be talking about your tactics, right? And we'll have a really healthy conversation about that. There is some assigned reading underneath Unit 11. So underneath Unit 11, where it says readings, I'm looking for you to read chapters 8 and 9. And in addition to that, there's 2 handouts attached there as well. One about non-media channels, one about traditional media channels. Separately, last but not least, your third campaign draft is due next week. So I really want to work to get your elements of feedback back to you. Right now, I also have your situation analysis due as well. I'm going to push that back to the following week. I'll be pushing that back to week 12. So your situation analysis will be due 2 weeks from today. I'm going to be moving that assignment though, so you've got some more time to work on it, and you'll see an email come out about that. So again, next week, what I need from you is draft number 3. Situation analysis is getting pushed back 2 weeks. I will continue to look at those midterms and review them. If you happen to miss the midterm, let's have a conversation about that. More importantly, as you continue to work hard on these projects, you folks are doing a good job, so stick in there. Hang on, very curious to see what the finish line will look like. Does anybody have any questions that I can help answer before we sign off for today?
Yeah, Professor, for draft number 3, what parts of the template should we complete?
Sure, let's look at that together. Give me one quick second. I'm going to go to that portion of Blackboard, and we'll take a closer look at that together. Give me just a moment to get there. Okay, so let's see. Here we have it. Share my screen with you now. So this is our run of show, and you can see that we're right about here. All right. So for next week, I'm looking for you to be able to include your objectives, your key theme and message, and not complete, but your ideas for your strategies and your tactics, okay? So you can just have general ideas sketched out, nothing too crazy, right? But again, looking for your objectives, looking for your key theme and messages. Your messages would relate to any of your primary publics, and then any ideas for strategies and tactics that you may have. Again, you can continue to utilize the PR campaign planning template that you have to get this stuff done. Does that answer your question, Kiara?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I forgot that we have this
No worries. No worries. This is accessible for you underneath course content.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Does anybody else have any questions? Going once, going twice? Okay. Last bit of information for you I just saw come across my email is, I believe it will be November 13th, 14th, 15th, or 14th, 15th, 16th, something like that. It looks like the university will be having a virtual career fair. So definitely keep your eyes and ears open for that. I'll send you a note about that after class. Stay well, everybody. Any questions you have, certainly feel free to reach out. And like I said, keep doing great work. We'll see you next week. And thanks for your patience
Thank
this week,
you.
too. Take care.
Thank you.
That's right.